Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this graduation day, which is an incredible time to celebrate. My name is Jodi Sandfort, and I have the great privilege of being the dean at the Evans School. And I'd like to welcome the faculty, staff, family, friends, and graduates. This is a commencement, and it's a day to savor. So there was a lot going on during this last month on campus. You had theses to complete, capstones to do, class projects. We also had a graduate student labor negotiation, a one-day strike, and the ratification of that labor agreement. Like universities, we also had students responding to the war between Israel and Hamas and the humanitarian tragedy that has unfolded in Gaza by establishing an encampment. I had significant conversations with Evans student leaders and their uncertainty on how the UW would respond, given the violence erupting on other campuses. And when student protesters were provoked and police brought in. Although there were not any arrests on any college campuses in Washington state, it was really unsettling when it was unfolding because we really didn't know what would happen here. Yet student leaders and academic leaders navigated really complex situations that literally could have gone crosswise. And they came to a peaceful resolution because they engaged in dialogue. It reminded me of what volumes of political science research says, that when you have problems in democracy, what you need is more democracy. In fact, last week, our Evans School students pulled together a teach-in to learn more about how to understand the events. One of the speakers, Michael McPherson, shared his reflections as a military veteran who is engaged in the international movement for peace. His work took him almost 10 years ago to Ferguson, Missouri, after Michael Brown was shot by police. He talked about the experiences he had and the insights and his love for his country, even with its challenges and its imperfections. At the end of the talk, he referred to something that took me by surprise. He called himself a patriot. And that word really stuck with me. It's not a word that I've used to define myself. As somebody who was raised in the 70s and the 80s, it seemed to be a charged word, used to claim authority and silence dissent, used to evoke almost blind faith to a country. And yet, in the last week, I literally have not been able to stop thinking about it. And I'm hoping that some of those reflections might be relevant to graduates, given this time in which we find ourselves. I've just actually finished a book by Donnie Bunch called A Fool's Errand. And he recounts the story of creating the National Museum for African American History and Culture as part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Now, this museum is one of the best social history museums in the world, and if you haven't been there, I really encourage you to come. But one of the amazing things about Dr. Bunch's story was that the institution was created during the presidential administrations of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. And the idea for the museum was first suggested in 1915 during the grip of Jim Crow in the southern parts of this country. And many people kept the vision, and it evolved over the last 100 years. But Dr. Bunch describes the strategic leadership he carried out over a decade to build the public institution. Now, there are a lot of details. How to establish the timeline of when the museum would start. He had this good idea to say, we want to connect it to the past, to the history of oppression. So let's have the museum open 150 years after the end of the and 50 years after the signing of the Voting Rights Act. He also had to talk about and think about how to site the museum. There are a lot of interests that wanted that museum to be tucked far away from the mall in DC, but he advocated and made sure that that museum is sited on Constitution Avenue, right next to the Washington Monument and the White House. He also had to think about how to develop a collection And he did so by creating a Save Our African American Treasures program that was modeled after the Antiques Roadshow, because it allowed people, everyday people, to think about what are the artifacts that are important to their family. He writes, quote, "One can tell a great deal about a country by what it remembers, by what graces the walls of a museum, what monuments have privileged placement in parks. Yet one also learns even more about a nation about what it forgets, what moments of evil, disappointment, and defeat are downplayed or eliminated in the national narrative." As I reflected on this story and what Mr. McPherson shared in the teach-in, I feel like this is a moment for me to consider a powerful question about patriotism. And therefore, I think it's powerful for you to think about it. Can I see and claim dissent and strategic institution building as fundamentally patriotic acts? Patriotism is a feeling of love, of commitment, of loyalty. And as all the parents and grandparents who've assembled here know, love, commitment, and loyalty do not mean agreement or blind faith. It requires tough conversations and hanging in there when oftentimes you just want to walk away. Like all generations, we are facing our own challenges. You know them: misinformation that spreads through social media, the rise of artificial intelligence and the ethical use of it, wars where violence is unleashed on citizens, the facts and consequences of climate change, fraying of the social contract, and basic understanding of the operation of governments, including the courts and the presidency. And like all generations, we disagree about how to respond to these challenges. The disagreement obviously is at all levels: national, state, local, even in the discussions I had in the last few weeks about how the Evans School should respond to the Israel-Hamas war. Unlike past generations, though, somewhere along the way, we've forgotten that what matters is not the disagreements, but how we respond to them. Do we demonize those who disagree with us, who use different language, who might look different than us, who have different values? Do we think of them as subhuman, worthy of ridicule and disdain? Or do we get curious, look at the facts, try to understand the perspectives of those we disagree with, and find a way forward? At UW in the last month, we took this last path. 10 days ago, in fact, I hosted a meeting in which a student leader and academic leader, who were the key actors in the popular University on Gaza encampment on UW, told their story. Now, this was a story of grave disagreements about financial and investment tactics, corporate accountability, and the adequacy of faculty expertise. But it was also a story of when it came to a moment about whether or not to escalate the conflict and resort to violence, people on both sides decided to find a glimmer of trust, to recognize that there was shared humanity and there was an opportunity to try and respect them. In listening to the story, it was clear that people on both sides of this took real personal risk. Their intellect, their integrity, their fundamental identity were attacked in public. And yet they persevered and found a way to find things that they could agree upon to craft a way forward. This theme is clear in Mr. McPherson's story from the teach-in, in Dr. Bunch's story from the National African American Museum. All experience threats and uncertainty that come from deep disagreement. But in all of these cases, people didn't try to tamp down and control the situation, hide behind bureaucratic structures and technical barriers. They didn't resort to shame or blame or demand compliance. Instead, they had just addressed the disagreement and conflict by choosing to trust the possibility of change in human beings. They chose to believe that through discussion, negotiation, and strategic action, something new would emerge. I'm beginning to realize that that is patriotic. In Ferguson, it sparked a social movement about the role of law enforcement in the lives of Black Americans and a ruling at the Department of Justice of unlawful conduct. In DC, it led to the creation of a national monument that provides an opportunity to tell the quintessential American story. Dr. Brunch claims that legacy when he writes, quote, "If one wants to understand the core American values of optimism, resiliency, and spirituality, where better than to look than African American history?" Patriotism. That word still feels unusual on my lips, and yet I know that democracy is how we do, not what we say. So in these times, I'm realizing that it is deeply patriotic to acknowledge that real democracy is messy and scary and uncertain. We are going to continue to face situations in which threat is high and trust is low. But we each need to consider the small ways that we can make a difference. We need to reject the voices that tell us to give up, become small, that your voice doesn't matter. We need to trust in what might emerge when humans talk and listen, and to see these as moments of public service, to see these as patriotic acts. In your time at the Evans School, you've experienced and learned a lot about the practices of making and implementing public policy. On this day, I so want you to feel proud of your accomplishments and recognize that by receiving these degrees, the faculty believe you are equipped to bring professional skills to the essential patriotic duty of helping us build the vibrant democratic processes and practices that we now clearly need. Congratulations.